warm welcome to all of you. Apur, should we begin?
Yeah, sure, Ranu.
Yes.
Lovely to be here.
Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Lucknow is extremely proud of its distinguished alumnus, Shri Kunwar Narain ji. Shri Kunwar Narain did his post-graduation in English literature in 1951. And this is 2021. 70 years later, we are here celebrating his contribution to literature. And it is an honor to be in the company of his illustrious son, Apurva Narain, who has translated some of his writings. No Other World, The Play of Dolls, and then here we have Witnesses of Remembrance, his recent collection of poems that have been translated by Apurva. It is his most recent book. It has come out in 2021. And then we also have The Play of Dolls, a translation of his short stories, which has been done by Apurva Narain and John Bater. We are very happy that we are having, as part of this translation series, we are holding a conversation with Apurva Narain on his father, the illustrious poet, Kunwar Narain. Kunwar Narain is considered one of India's foremost poets, thinkers, and literary figures of modern times. He was an avid traveler with an international sensibility, but firmly grounded in Indian history and thought. He has written in diverse genres, including 3 epic poems, 8 poetry collections, translations of world poetry, books of short stories, criticism, essays, diaries, conversations. He wrote for more than 7 decades. His first book came out in 1956. It was a unique interplay of the simple and the complex. And after having spent 5 decades in Lucknow, he moved to Delhi. And, today we are going to discuss his association with Lucknow. What was the contribution of Lucknow in his life, and Lucknow made him, and he also gave up a certain space and name on the literary map. And then, having received several awards like the Sahitya Academy Awards, Kabir Samman, Kumaran Award, Medal of Warsaw University, Italy's Premio Ferronia for Distinguished World Author, Civilian Honor, Padma Bhushan, and the Gyanpith Award, you name it, and he's there, and he's got that award. He is one of the most distinguished writer of our times. Kunwar Narain ji passed away in 2017, and his son, Apurva Narain, with a certain passion, with a lot of commitment, dedication, and love for his father, has drowned himself in his writings and is translating him. I think, Apurva, I would like to begin with the first sentence that you have written in your introduction to Witnesses of Remembrance, where you say that when you talk of your father, you write that I remember a river flowing inside my father and never growing old. Let us begin with this intimate association with nature, with world, with this universe, and how beautifully he blended the inner and the outer worlds in his poetry. Apur?
Thank you, Ranu. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful session. I don't know how many people are there and who's seeing us, but I'm so pleased to be here because this has a lot of emotional value for me as well. It's my father's university, and it's also a city where I grew up as a child. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Lucknow. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here in your company and the company of the Department of English and European Languages of Lucknow University. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't know where to begin. Perhaps, as you rightly said, there's so many dimensions to his work. It's a work that spans 7 decades, and there's a huge variety in his work. both poetry and prose. So it would be very difficult to try and assemble all of it in the space of an hour. I think we shouldn't even try to do that. Instead, what I'll do is I'll just kind of eclectically pick on a few points that I thought might be relevant for a session like this. I assume that most of the audience is students, so some kind of a broad introduction to his work might be in order. And I'd also like to talk about his association with Lucknow, which is so very fundamental, especially in his formative period. And he spent, as you said, half a century in Lucknow, literally, so more than that. So it's a very important association. And the last, maybe we can get on to these two specific books and talk about some of the translation aspects and how I've approached the translations and what's been presented in these two books. So, I mean, please feel free to just butt in and ask me some questions. And if you feel I'm going somewhere else, just take me to where you want me to be speaking about. But I'll begin maybe with his association with Lucknow, firstly. That's I think most relevant for a session organized by the Lucknow University. So he came to Lucknow in the 1940s, from Ayodhya, which is his place of birth. And there were several, I think this context is very relevant to his work, which is why I wanted to talk about it. There were several family deaths at that time. The cure for tuberculosis hadn't been invented, and there were several tuberculosis-related deaths in his family, including that of his mother and sister, who he was very close to, and at a very early age. And he came and lived in a joint family. That house is still there on Shah Najaf Road. Number 4 Shah Najaf Road is still there. That's where he spent his early years as a student, as a student first of Christian College, where he did his intermediate and bachelor's, and then Lucknow University, where he did his master's in English literature. So that house used to be a very, very significant venue for a lot of the freedom movement in the city, and the activities related to the freedom movement in the city. And people like Nehru and Lohia and Sarojini Naidu and Sucheta Kriplani, Acharya Kriplani, all these were regular visitors to that house. I think it's in order to mention two specific figures who really influenced him early on. One was Narendra Dev, Acharya Narain Dev, as he's called. He was also the Vice Chancellor of Lucknow University, I think from 47 to 51 or something like that. And he had a very, very strong influence on my father very early on. And he was a very, very distinguished scholar, both of Buddhism and of Marxism. And whatever imprints we see of Buddhism and Marxism on his writing and on his thinking, perhaps owe their genesis to this period with Narain Dev. He actually spent a year with him in Bombay as well, in Juhu, and read a lot at that time and discussed a lot with Narain Dev, and who was a really enlightened scholar and intellectual in his own right, apart from being a political figure. And second, as I said, was Acharya Kriplani, who was more active in politics in a way, even ran for elections and things. And he used to edit a journal called Vigil, on which my father participated. That was shortly after his stay with Narain Dev. And both these figures had a huge influence on his early thinking. It would also be in order to recall some of the figures from Lucknow University. He has always very fondly talked of his teachers and professors of Lucknow University. There used to be Professor Siddhant, who used to be the head of the English department at that time when my father was there. And they were both very fond of each other. And there were also professors like Professor Radha Kamal Mukherjee and Radha Kumud Mukherjee, who used to be in economics and history. And my father often told me about how he used to attend classes across different disciplines. He used to, in his spare time, go and sit in the classes of Radha Kamal Mukherjee or Radha Kamal Mukherjee. And he's always had this huge interest in different disciplines. His library now is something like 20,000 books, which I've somehow preserved in Delhi. In Lucknow, it used to be even larger. And apart from a collection of the best poetry that you could find in India, world poetry, there's a whole stream of disciplines in that library, represented in that library, from philosophy to history to sociology, anthropology, economics, science, politics. He read voraciously. He read world literatures, he read Indian literatures from different languages, of course, in translation. And so that whole reading and whole intellectual engagement with world literature and world thought has been very central to his development as a writer as well. And you'll see a lot of his poetry comes from that intellectual side of things. There's a scientific temperament to the poems, apart from, of course, being passion-centric and emotion-centric. Apart from that, in 1956, he moved from this joint family home in Chanajaf Road to his own home. He built it himself in Mahanagar. And from 1956 to 2006, that house remained. Unfortunately, we couldn't keep that house after that, and it was sold, and now there's the ugly set of shops and metro and all that over there. That's the curse of modern development. But especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it used to be a very, very rich milieu of that house. And growing up there as a child, I remember all kinds of cultural and literary figures coming to our house. There used to be regular music performances from Amir Khan to Pandit Jasraj to Malini Rajurkar to Ghulam Mustafa, Sangyupta Pandigrahi. Then Satyajit Ray shot his film from there, Shatranj Ke Khiladi. There used to be all kinds of film and theater personalities, Ibrahim El-Qazi, Richard Schechner, all kinds of scholars from abroad who stayed there. And virtually everybody from the literary world who passed through Lucknow at that point of time stayed there. And it was a kind of a literary and cultural magnet of the city. And before that, of course, Kunwar Narain had a very strong association with certain institutions in Lucknow. He used to be a regular at the British Library. He used to be a regular at Ram Advani's bookshop. He used to, I believe early on, he used to have a seat reserved in Mayfair Theatre. He was very, very fond of world cinema. And every time the films used to change every week, and he used to go and see those in the evenings. And later on, this developed into his interest in world cinema, and there's a whole book of his on that. That's about his association with Lucknow broadly. I mean, if there's some specific aspects you'd like to know.
What else did he have to say about Lucknow University and primarily the Department of English and Modern European Languages?
He's very fond of it. He was very, as I said, he was so attached to that whole period of his life because those were his formative years. That's when his interest in literature developed, and he had very, very strong associations with his professors. And as I mentioned, some of them. He also, he was also learning French over there at that point of time. And I believe there was some professor called André Levy. I've not been able to pinpoint his exact time and time frame. And he began translating some of the French symbolist poets at that point of time with André Levy. So his earliest brush with world literature was through translation, in fact. And he translated poets like Mallarmé and Valéry and Baudelaire through this route of associating with his professor. Unfortunately, those translations have been lost because they were done very, very early in the 50s. And I believe they were sent to some journal and they got lost there. There was no computer then, nothing of that sort. It was just all physical. There's a book of his I'll talk about later that has come out with his translations of about 30 world poets. Because he was, as I said, extremely fond of reading, and his library had all kinds of journals. He used to get Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, Encounter, and all these journals, and he used to keep reading. And whenever he liked a poem a lot, he translated it. So it wasn't a project that he wasn't sitting down and doing a book of translations, but he just kept doing it for his own pleasure. And that has come into a book now. But these translations, as I said, the earliest ones have been lost, unfortunately.
Okay, literature for him becomes the channel to open up a conversation with the world. And on one hand, when we read him and we read about his life, we realize that he was a recluse who was a very private person. But on the other hand, poetry, literature, short stories, the way he communicates with the world, and he opens a new world in front of us through his writings.
Right.
How do you see, he has often been, it is said that he was neither a Marxist, he never claimed to be a Marxist, and he refused to be categorized, or, he defied categorization. Now, in his writing, I see that on one hand, there is that spirit of Buddha. And on the other hand, there is also the humanism of Kabir. So, and he blends the two very beautifully.
Right.
So when you read his poems, you realize that, he's talking about very ordinary things, but in such an extraordinary manner.
Absolutely. You're totally right. And the very first opening line that you mentioned, and how I've started my introduction about the river flowing inside. And this is taken from a poem from my first collection called The River Doesn't Grow Old. And I think what's happening in his work is that all these dichotomies, all these binaries between the self and the other, inside and outside, Buddhism versus Marxism, private versus the world, these are constantly being broken. And it's a very unified, non-dualist view of the world that develops in his work. And I see this more and more as I plod more and more into his work. I mean, I'm still at the surface, literally, because I've done 3 books of translation, and his entire span of work is much more than that. But this is what I've been discovering, that all these binaries become increasingly kind of redundant in his case. He had a very eclectic mind, a very gentle, very noble kind of disposition. And he liked to absorb and internalize things, and sit and read for days on end before. He was in no hurry to complete a book or to get it published. And he was definitely a recluse, definitely very private. But there was, as I said, this period in Lucknow in the 60s and the 70s when he did have a lot of visitors in the house, and all these people came and stayed, and there was a huge cultural kind of atmosphere in the house at the time I was growing up. So that period was definitely he was participating much more actively in the general cultural sphere, so to say. But when he came to Delhi in the 90s, and especially in his old age, and even before that, fundamentally he's been a recluse. I don't think it would be wrong to say that. And you're right. I mean, he was never a robe-donning Buddhist or a card-carrying communist, or he was never, besotted with movements, and people slotted him into movements. So he became a Nai Kavita poet. He became a Pragativad poet, and so on and so forth. But he never himself identified with any of these movements or
any of these vads.
He kept himself out of all these. He was never keen to join committees or powers of positions. He kept refusing throughout throughout his life. I mean, even later on, of course, was age and those kind of things. But even before, he was always out of this.
He kept himself out of all vad and vivad.
Vivad, and even more than that, even events. I mean, festivals, events, committees, positions. There were constant stream of requests for him to join this or be on that committee, or go to Harvard, or go to Japan, or go to Tokyo. He kept refusing everything. So that was his nature. That was he is a poet. He liked to be with his poetry, and he spent his life doing that, essentially.
Now, going back to your childhood, I would like to know, what was your reaction as a child when you came to know that your father was a poet?
Well, I mean, it was a very rich experience for me. As I said, I grew up in a house full of books, full of these cultural figures, full of writers coming in every day, staying with us. And of course, my father himself. I used to see him day and night. So So one had exposure to all this, and I'm very fortunate to have had that. So from a very early age, I started reading. I started dipping into his library and reading what I liked, and so developed an interest in literature of my own. And I think I owe it to that period because and to his whole kind of aura and his whole sort of personality, which obviously influenced me in very positive ways. And
Because it's a very remarkable thing to say, and this is what you say, that I never once saw him get angry or talk ill of anyone or even hurt a fly. So this shows that how kind-hearted he was. Like as a son, you are making such a statement about your father, that you never saw him hit a fly or speak ill of anyone. That says a lot about this man.
Absolutely. And it's not just me. I mean, a lot of people say this about him, and he's known for this side of his personality. He's a very, as I said, very gentle, very soft-spoken, very polite. So a lot of people have associated him with saintly qualities, and that's why he's been called the Buddha, and he's been called all kinds of, adjectives have been used for him. So definitely, I mean, the side of his personality was there, and I saw it from a very early age and from a very close range, right up to the end, and definitely has influenced me in many ways.
That's where somewhere you say that translation too is like praying or loving or writing, and it is better directed at changing oneself rather than changing the world,
Yes.
So this act of translation, and you've been so deeply involved in it, how has it helped you evolve as a person while you were translating Kunwar Narain?
That's a very difficult question to answer. But I think yes. I mean, as I said, his approach to writing wasn't that he looked at it as a career or as a performance or as something to get anything out of. It was an act. It was a very personal act, like loving or praying, or as I said. And
you do say, let me just interrupt, because you do say, Apurv, that these poems changed me rather more than I changed them.
Yes,
they changed me. So how have they?
So I think,
just explain this process to us. We'd be interested in knowing how.
Yeah, so I think it's linked to his writing itself, because that was what was happening to him. As I said, when he wrote, he internalized things for a long time before he wrote it. Everything that he wrote was lived. Everything that he wrote was lived and internalized, and what he read was internalized, and that came out in writing. So I'm sure what he was writing was changing him at some level. And when I'm translating him, it's a similar kind of process at work. I couldn't just do a word-to-word translation and bring out any poetry in Kunwar Narain's work. That's impossible, because you have to, at some level, internalize those poems. You have to live those poems. You have to feel those poems. And then you go through multiple drafts and multiple revisions and the technical part of it, and the wrestling with the language part of it. And so this whole process can be quite time consuming at times. And it can also be life-changing, in the sense that it obviously affects you deeply, and the poem has to affect you deeply to be translated into a good translation. Otherwise, it's a very, translation can work at so many levels. I mean, you can translate something very quickly and it won't have the same depth. And these translations have taken me a long time as well. Especially my last book, Witnesses of Remembrance. This was begun shortly after my first book, which was No Other World, which is this one. It was begun shortly after this, but then there was a whole series of medical issues with my parents and this and that, and there were a lot of gaps and a lot of hiatuses in the making of it. And so it's also been a very long drawn affair, and I kept getting back to it, to some poems coming out of it, and I finally got to it last year and gave it the shape of a book. So this whole process has been a journey of sorts as well. a life-changing journey, I would say. And these poems have been his later poems in his book. So I saw several of these poems being made. I saw several of these poems being written. I knew the experiences that went behind those poems. And so when you're translating something like that, it obviously is much more than a literal translation or language to language translation. There's much more. It's, I like to say that.
Yeah.
I like to say that what we're translating are not the words of the poem, but the soul state of the author, which went into writing those words.
Yeah.
And that's what's important in a translation, that you actually capture the ethos and the soul of the author at the time he was writing those words. And that's
very true. You've soaked yourself in his work with such passion and depth that the translation itself seems as if it has been written in English, and it does not look like a translation. So here's a very short poem, Tunisia Ka Kunwar. I was struck by the imagery, the unusual way in which he has talked about human existence. Tunisia में एक कुआं है, कहते हैं उसका पानी धरती के अंदर ही अंदर उस पवित्र कुएं से जुड़ा है जो मक्का में है. मैंने तो ये भी सुना है कि धरती के अंदर ही अंदर हर कुएं का पानी हर कुएं से जुड़ा है. There's this communion that he sets with the universe. There's that sense of oneness.
Yeah.
There is that sense of togetherness which is there in his poetry, which is extremely, it is eye-catching, and it really shakes you to the core. Yeah. And then you translate it into a well in Tunisia. There is a well in Tunisia whose water, it is said, deep down inside the earth unites with that sacred well in Mecca. In fact, I have even heard that deep down inside the earth, the water of every well unites with every well everywhere. That sense of oneness, that we are all one, we come from the same source. This has been, it's absolutely amazing, the way he handles, ideas, emotions, feelings. And you are quite right that we have to get into the soul of a poem to be able to translate it. So translation, which is transcreation, is also, entering into a world which does not belong to you, but then it becomes yours.
Absolutely. Very well.
Yeah. Is there any poem of his that you would like to talk about, or some experience while translating?
Yeah, in fact,
Kunwar Narain?
Absolutely. And then, in fact, I'll begin with the same poem that you just read out. Now, this is a very interesting history. And there are several poems in this collection, not several, but some poems in this collection, which, in the later years, he had stopped traveling and he couldn't really step out because of his age, and he lost his eyesight for the last 5 years as well. And I have been a very, very avid traveler throughout my life. I mean, for well over 3 decades, I've just roamed around the globe. And so I used to come back with experiences, and I used to talk about these experiences to him, about my travels. And lo and behold, 2 months later, I used to see a poem on that. So Tunisia Ka Kunwar is one such poem. I had gone to Tunisia. There is a city there called Kerouan where such a well actually exists. And I mentioned this to him. And this is the poem. As a result of it, it really affected him. The metaphor of the well being connected to the well in Mecca really moved him, and this was a result of that. Likewise, there are poems on Angkor Wat, or there's a poem called Some Days in Another Place, Another Time. These are all poems that have resulted from some sort of a conversation I've had on my travels with him. The travel-related poems, and so that has been a very interesting experience for me to see my travel experiences take the form of his poem.
Okay, and some of his own poems were also based on his travel experiences, like his meeting Hikmet, Nazim Hikmet, Pablo Neruda. He has written about his.
Now that is also a very. He met Hikmet and Pablo Neruda and these people in a trip that he did in 1955. Shortly after his MA at Lucknow University. And he writes this poem in the 2000 decade, 45 years later.
Okay.
So this is again another illustration of the fact that he's never in a hurry to do things, to write a poem, to write a book, to publish. So this just came to him at that point of time, and so that's why a lot of poems collected in this latest collection have to do with remembrances, have to do with recollections of sorts. And this was a kind of a 40-year, 50-year-old afterthought of his meetings with these people. But I should add that he has been more of an intellectual traveler. He's read through books. He's traveled also. He's traveled quite a bit, but not as much as many other travelers. His travel has been through books and books of all kinds, world literatures, disciplines, as I said. So that has been his primary form of travel. Would you like to hear this poem in his voice?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
That I thought might be interesting.
ट्यूनीशिया का कुआं। ट्यूनीशिया में एक कुआं है, कहते हैं उसका पानी धरती के अंदर ही अंदर उस पवित्र कुएं से जुड़ा है जो मक्का में है। मैंने तो यह भी सुना है कि धरती के अंदर ही अंदर हर कुएं का पानी हर कुएं से जुड़ा है।
That's the point. So fortunately, in 2012, there was a recording done of his some of his recitations, and he shortly after that he lost his eyesight. So it was very fortunate that we have some poems at least in his voice in a CD, about 25, 30 poems are there.
As we look at his short stories, having read some of his short stories in his collection, The Play of Dolls, I think again, another aspect of his personality emerges, and that is, he's very gentle in his short stories, and yet there is the firmness, that's very firm in his conviction, and he talks of love in a Kafkaesque way, how emotions and relationships are formed, and it's a new kind of a story. I think Narain as a short story writer is also a revelation to me.
Yeah, these stories are very different from the stories that were being written or are being written or have been written. In the period when they were written, the Nai Kahani movement was also going on along with the Nai Kavita movement, and that Nai Kahani movement was a entirely different take on short story writing. They were realist stories with real life characters and depictions of real life. Whereas in this book, you will find that the stories are almost like thought experiments. They are almost scientific experiments at times, and they cross different genres. They can be overlapping with poetry or with essay or with travelogue or with thought or different kinds of writing. So, and the second collection of his that has come out after a posthumous collection even extends that further. So that has not been translated as yet, but that extends it further. So definitely the stories are very different. And even within the collection, you'll find there's a range, because there are some stories that are very poetic. For example, the title story of the Hindi collection, Akaron Ke Aspas, which is the last story in this collection, Near and Around Shapes, or Fear, or stories like that. They have a very, as you said, a Kafkaesque quality to them, a poetic. I mean, the Near and Around Shapes could be a prose poem as much as a short story. And on the other hand, a very witty, satirical stories like The Big Man or
like The Official, also the biting satire in The Official, how he concludes the story. It's done so beautifully. There's something surreal about his kind of writing.
Yeah, the stories are very different from his poems, firstly.
Yes,
and
very
they have a very big range in terms of, they can be poetic, they can be cinematic. I mean, you take a story like The Shirt, it's a very cinematic kind of a story. The Mughal Sultanate and the Bishti takes you into a historical period, and so it's a very different setting over there. some are wit and irony-based stories, some are kind of just thought experiments, as I said. So there's a range, and it was very interesting. I translated this book with my co-translator. He's a young American translator called John Bater. And it was a very interesting experience to translate the stories for me, because I had somehow been always engaged with his poetry. And the stories only cropped up, the translation of these stories only cropped up in 2018. And it was done much more quickly than I've done the poetry. And so it was done in a span of 2 years, and I really enjoyed it. It was an eye-opener for me, the stories, yeah.
Yes. Okay. When you talk of translation, like his original poems are taught, he taught and very precise, and he's a man of few words. Yeah. Now, when you were translating, what were the major challenges that you faced while translating Kunwar Narain?
I think that's a very, very important question you've asked, and a very, very relevant question. In Kunwar Narain's poetry, the words are so precise. You can't remove or adjust even one word from here to there. It changes the layers of meaning which don't become visible on the first reading. When you first read a poem, it might, and if you read it hurriedly, it might come across as a very simple poem, a very ordinary poem. But it opens up very slowly and very in repeated readings and with a lot of patience from your reader. So when you're translating such a poem, at one level you have to be very careful about the words, which I've talked about in my first book. I've quoted Walter Benjamin and the importance of words in a translation. And so words are very important in Kunwar Narain's case, because you can't replace even one single word in his poetry and not affect the entire idea. But given the act of translation and the sort of compromises one has to make between rhythm and between content and between the visual structure of the poem and the verbal sound effects of it, one obviously has to make compromises all along. So one principle that I found very helpful and very instructive is not to follow any principle. So I have very consciously avoided approaching poetry translation, especially Kunwar Narain's poetry, with a set translation theory in mind, or with a particular a priori kind of objective. And I've let the poet and the poem dictate the approach to that particular translation. And so we'll find that in the book, both books, the first book and this book, there's a range of approaches to translation as well. I have approached different poems with some are very literal, very precise in replicating the Hindi. In some, I've taken very huge liberties. I've changed the visual structure of the poem. I've changed the title of the poem. I've gone from singular to plural, or from first person to third person. And so this whole spectrum of fidelity versus freedom is kind of represented across poems. You can't choose one end of the spectrum and approach all poems with that same perspective. So different poems demand different approaches in his work, and which is why I've this is again something that I've often quoted Walter Benjamin on, which is that you let the poem dictate your approach to the translation. And the intent of the poem, as I said, what is the central intent of the poem, which has been represented in different theories in different ways. Some people have called it the central element, some have called the semantic dominant, some have called it the poetic act of remembering, some have called it the intent. So that central aspect becomes very, very important to keep in mind. And then the periphery kind of flows out of it in the translation.
It's true that each reading of a poem throws up new layers of meaning, and it's true of Kunwar Narain that if you wish to read him, you have to read him slowly, gently, just savor the taste of every image and word that he uses in his poem. Yeah. And as a translator, I think that's equally important, because the way you bring up the beauty of his images, and how you how it crystallizes into a poem in English, whatever he has said in Hindi, how beautifully and deftly you put it in English. But could you refer to one of the poems that you have really enjoyed and
Sure.
working on, or is there a poem that you would like to discuss?
But I mean, yeah, from the point of view of what we are discussing in terms of the translation approach to that poem, if you look at a poem like Postmortem of a Phoenix, now this is a poem which in the Hindi has a very tight structure. The three stanzas, and in each stanza has the first line and the last line of one length, and the four between lines of a similar length. And there's a very strong rhyme sense, both internal rhymes and external rhymes. And I think that this whole structure was very critical to this poem. So in the English translation, I have tried to replicate that, and I replicate it almost, of course, I mean, the way it's measured in Hindi is through matras, and the way you measure it in English could be accent or syllable or whatever. But this is an example of a poem where I've followed a very, very precise route to replicating the structure of the poem. And if you compare it with a poem like Invitation or with In the Lanes and By Lanes of the Past, I've totally changed the structure over there. I've changed the visual structure of the poem even. So there was a certain wandering in this poem, In the Lanes and By Lanes of the Past. And I kind of visually depicted that wandering by indenting certain paragraphs. So if you see that poem, I felt that the structure was better captured visually that way. So, I mean, there's just examples of, now, if you take a poem like Golconda in the same collection, it's a longish poem. Here, the central intent that I was talking about, the semantic dominant or the idea that was most important, was the rhythm that was being created through the atmosphere. This poem has a very strong atmosphere, a very strong rhythm, even though the lines are not metrical, they're not kind of, there's no structure to that, metrical structure to that poem. There are no rhymes, there's very little alliteration, there's very little use of anaphora or anything like that. But it has a very strong rhythm, which is based on the atmosphere he's creating of that whole place of Golconda. So my first objective in translating a poem like that would have been to replicate that atmosphere, replicate that rhythm. And
Apurva, there is one poem, The Pandemic of Numbers, on page 117,
right.
Which I must tell my audience, my listeners, that my students, that, it's a poem that speaks for our times. And you begin to wonder how well ahead of his times was he. He was such a visionary. आंकड़ों की बीमारी. एक बार मुझे आंकड़ों की उल्टियां होने लगी. It's a long poem. I'll just read one or two stanzas. एक बार मुझे आंकड़ों की उल्टियां होने लगी. गिनते गिनते जब संख्या करोड़ों को पार करने लगी, मैं बेहोश हो गया. और उसके बाद, after that, what does he say in the end? हम सब एक नाजुक दौर से गुजर रहे हैं. तादाद के मामले में उत्तेजना घातक हो सकती है. आंकड़ों पर कोई दवा काम नहीं करती. शांति से काम लें. अगर बच गए तो आप तो करोड़ों में एक होंगे. This is something, that is so true for our times, because what is he doing? He is a visionary. He is a man who has an eye, who can look into the future. And he talks about the times, and this is what we are going through right now. Aakde, pandemic. Absolutely. And we are passing through friable times. Excitement over data can be fatal. No medicines work on it. Stay calm. If you are saved, you would be 1 in a million. Oh, that's amazing.
And this poem was written in the early 90s, you can imagine.
Yeah.
So,
and no one had heard of this pandemic. And, and he could actually dream. And he's actually a visionary who has the ability to see, what lies beyond. And that's where the beauty of the man lies, and that's where you call him a saint. He has that saintly quality, that quality of a man who was not just rooted to the earth, but who could actually connect with the divine, with the,
There's several poems here, the poems that kind of delve into your autobiographical self or an auto-fictional self. And from that, he kind of makes in this case, there's a prediction of almost of what's happening now. But in many other cases, there's a larger theme for the world that is discovered out of that delving into the self. So definitely there's a visionary quality and insight in his work. Yeah.
So is there something more that you would like to say to our students and our teachers? Because they are all agog with curiosity. They have read Kunwar Narain. He's prescribed in our course. And I have 3 of my students who would actually be reading one of his poems. And may I please ask Akanksha to read one of the poems here?
Good evening, everyone. So I would first read the poem in Hindi, Cheel. अतल में डूबे मनमौजी पंख, एक अक्षर सूने पृष्ठ पर शीर्षक, निरर्थक को सार्थक सा बनाती, नटखट गुदगुदी से धीर गंभीर आकाश को हंसाती, समाज चिन्ह जमीन और आसमान के बीच, एक साहसिक दृष्टि से जीवन, ऊंचाई पलायन नहीं, उत्कर्ष, उत्साह के स्तर से, अस्तित्व का सर्वेक्षण, एक को दूसरे के पास लाती, एक कील पर सारे आकाश को नचाती, हवा के कंधों पर सवार, गली कूचों के हस्तक्षेपों से परे, दूरबीनी आंखों से देखती हमें, कम बख्तियां जीते, खुद न जाने कितने कदमों पर टिकी डगमगाती जिंदगी और मौत के बीच, नन्ही सी जान झूम झूम जाती. And now the same poem in Hindi, translated by Sir. Falcon, whimsical wings drowned in the deep, a word on an empty page. The title makes the useless useful. With a wayward tickle, makes the ponderous sky laugh. A hyphen between land and sky. Life from a walrus view. The high, not a flight, a rise. From a level of verb, the survey of existence. Brings one and the other nearby. Swirls on a spike the entire sky. Atop the wind's shoulders, beyond the badger of lanes and by-lanes, with binocular eyes sees us, live out the wretched, itself purged on who knows how many perils, in sway between life and death, a little life swoons and swerves away. Thank you.
Thank you, Akanksha. I would now like to invite Pranjal to read On Both Sides of the Line.
Good evening to all present. I am Pranjal Krishna and I will be reading On Both Sides of the Line. And I'll first read it in Hindi. रेखा के दोनों ओर, एक बिंदु से दूसरे तक एक सीधी रेखा में अगर वह दौड़ता चला जाता तो भी जगह 2 साफ हिस्सों में बटी हुई दिखती, किंतु शुरू होती है चुटकुले सा चौकोर एक घर के सामने समानांतर सड़क, सड़क के दूसरी ओर दूसरा तजुर्बा, दूसरे रास्ते, चौराहे, दीवारें, और इन्हीं में कहीं बेढंगा फंसा एक त्रिकोण जिसका जिक्र उसकी कहानियों में काफी बाद तक रहा. इस सब के बावजूद उसने देखा कि अभी बहुत कुछ हो सकता था अगर उस बड़ी रेखा पर कहीं एक छोटा सा घेरा बना दिया जाए, इस तरह कि हर अनुभव आधा रेखा पर आधा उसके ऊपर. उसने देखा कि एक बंधी रेखा पर सीधे बढ़ते जाने से घेरे को बढ़ाते जाना उसके वक्त और जगह को अधिक माने देता था. दूसरों ने समझा कि वह अधूरा है, लेकिन यह उसकी अपनी शैली थी, इस तरह अपने को देखना मानो वह नहीं, उसकी वजह से बाकी सब पूरा है. And now I will read the same poem in English, titled On Both Sides of the Line. From dot to dot, if he ran in a straight line, the space would seem split into 2 clear halves. But to begin, there was a ridiculous 4-walled house, a parallel street facing it, across the street, another experience, more roads, crossroads, walls, and awkwardly thrust in these a triangle that remained in his stories long after. Despite all this, he saw much could yet be done if somewhere along the line a tiny circle were drawn so that an experience lay half on the line and half above. Then instead of continuing straight on a dotted line, continuing to enlarge the circle gave his time-space sense more meaning. That is, it let him give more to others and get more from others. Others thought he was incomplete, but it was his mind and style to so look at himself as if were not him, but because of him, all else looked complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Pranjal. I would now like to invite Pragya Tiwari to read Chakravyu.
The title of the poem is Chakravyu. I'll first recite it. युद्ध की प्रतिध्वनि जगाकर जो हजारों बार दोहराई गई, रक्त की गिरदावली कुछ और रंग कर लोरियों के संग जो गाई गई. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
उसी इतिहास की स्मृति उसी संसार में लौटे. ओ योद्धा तुम कौन? मैं नवगत व अजित अभिमन्यु, प्रारब्ध जिसका गर्भ से ही हो चुका निश्चय, अपरिचित जिंदगी के धूम फेंका हुआ उन्माद, बांधी पंक्तियों को तो क्रमशः लक्ष्य तक बढ़ता हुआ जयनाद. मेरे हाथ में टूटा हुआ पहिया, उछलती आग की तरह, बदन पर एक टूटा कवच, सारी देह शत विषम, धरती खून में ज्यों सनी लथपथ लाश, सिर पर गिरता मंडला रहा आकाश. मैं बलिदान इस संघर्ष कटु व्यंग इस तर्क पर, जो जिंदगी के नाम पर हारे, आहूत हर युद्धाग्नि व जीव हूँ निष्पाप, जिसको पूछ कर मारा गया, वह शीश जिसका रक्त सदियों तक बहा, वह दर्द जिसको बेगुनाहों ने कहा. Now I would like to recite the poem in English. Rousing the reverberations of war, repeated 1,000 times, recoloring the panegyric of blood, rendered with lullaby. Remembrance of that same past, return to that same word. O warrior, who are you? I am that unvanquished Abhimanyu, come fated from the womb of frenzied foe, in the gambit of a new life, breaking the ranks and fight, a victory call, moving slowly to it, broken wheel in hand, the dust of a melting fire band, flash armor on the body gashed and bloody, the earth, blood sodden like the dead, skies over it like vultures over. A sacrifice in this war, I am, a bitter mockery of the that failed in life's name, offered on each altar of war. A creature's dry neck, anointed to the sea, a head whose blood flowed for eons, a pain that innocent. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragya.
Thank you so much.
Now, I would like to keep it open for discussion. If there are any questions, please feel free. You can either put them in the chat box, or you could unmute yourself and ask your question. This is a brilliant opportunity for you to make the most of the presence of Apurva Narain in our midst.
Firstly, I must say how moved I am to hear these recitations from students of a university and department where my father had himself studied. It's a really moving experience for me. And thank you for the recitations, all of you.
Any questions? Professor Nishi Pandey is here in our midst. Would she like to say something?
Yes, Apurva, good evening, and thank you so much for this session.
Hello, Nishi.
coming in the centennial year, it's such a privilege and pleasure, and we hope that the discussions we've had about doing something more permanent for him at the university will shape up.
Right.
And I look forward to that, but it's been a really enriching session, and I must thank Ranu for that. And it's been a moving kind of session listening to you.
And please switch on your video, Nishi.
Yeah, because my connectivity is poor, Ranu. If I switch on the video, you will not be able to hear me.
Okay,
So,
okay.
I'm sorry about that. But
are there any questions?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nishini.
Any questions? To what extent was Mr. Narain influenced by world poetry? Did he explore writing in other languages? Yes, he did.
That's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
So as I said early on, that he has throughout been very, very voracious as a reader, and he read all kinds of literatures, and not just literature but across disciplines. And he has translated several poets from different world streams. He was very fond of East European poetry. He was very fond of Latin American poetry. And in terms of writing himself in another language, it's a very interesting thing that I must point out, that he began writing in English actually. After he finished his English literature MA from Lucknow University, he began writing in English, and he for several years he wrote in English, and he continued writing in English till the end. He used to write both in Hindi and in English, but he somehow chose to publish in Hindi, and there was another writer called Raghubir Sahai, who was his colleague in the same department at the same time. They were classmates. And I think he eventually pushed him more towards Hindi, but in the beginning he wrote in English. And apart from that, he knew a bit of Sanskrit, he knew a bit of Urdu, he knew a bit of French. So all these languages did play a part in his consciousness. And he, as I said, read across literatures, of course in English translation mostly, but he read a lot of world literature. So that has definitely been a huge influence.
Yeah. I think each one of us is extremely proud of the fact that he was one of us, and we belong to such an illustrious department. I think we all of us who've studied in this university, who are working here, are very, very proud to be a part of this university. And certainly Department of English and Modern European Languages.
No, I would be very happy if the university because I mean this is the beginning, but it's so moving for me, as I said, to see students and professors of this university and this department take interest in his work. It's really is the ultimate that I can hope for. I see a couple of questions.
There's a question here. Yeah. You have captured the pulse of his poetry. Do you feel you have added your own style to any of the poems? To what extent do you see the translator as an artist?
Right. I mean, very good question again. I would actually urge whoever is seriously interested in this work to read the introduction that I have for all the 3 books. Mm-hmm. And I've discussed this at length over there. So as I also mentioned that I do not approach a poem with a set mind, that I have to add a lot of my own or I have to take liberties with it. I let that decision come from the poem itself. So in some poems, I've taken a lot of liberties, and I have added to it as a creative artist myself, definitely. And in other poems, I felt that it's more important to be faithful to the poem's structure, or to the verbal rhythm, or to its visual structure, or whatever, and I followed that. So this decision has varied from poem to poem, I would say, and it's really dependent on the poem. I firmly believe that one can't approach poetry translation, especially poetry of somebody like Kunwar Narain, with a set paradigm that, okay, I'm going to add to it, or I'm not going to add to it. It should be dictated by the poem. Yeah. Is there another?
Yes, there is another question from Pragya Tiwari. It's a golden opportunity to listen to you. Do you think his poem was also written for marginalized sections of society? As in his poem Chakravyu, there is a layer of meaning which represents all innocent sections of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has always had the marginalized, the vulnerable, the ordinary as somebody very dear to his heart. And as we discussed in the beginning, he was not a card-carrying Marxist or anything in that sense. But these dimensions were very close to his heart. And the unusual thing about him is that he didn't belong to any camp, as I said. He wasn't Pragativad poet or a Prayogvad poet or whatever, but he definitely borrowed from all these camps, and he was influenced by all these camps, and he had the common man at the center of his poetry. And there's a whole section in the new book which I've called "Living Ordinary Lives." And that whole section is about poems of this sort. And as I said, again, it's not very easy to categorize Kunwar Narain. So even in a love poem or even in a nature poem, you would find elements of crisscrossing between his solicitude for a common person or a marginalized person. You see a poem like Wild Rose. Now that's a nature poem on the surface of it, but he's actually talking about tribals. He's actually talking about Adivasis in that poem.
Yes, an artist par excellence. His heart was with the common man. He always wrote about people who are on the margins, on the periphery. That's very true about him. There's another question. As a translator, how does one avoid transcreation while translating? This is a question from Amrita Sharma. How does one avoid transcreation?
Well, you again don't have to avoid it. If you feel the poem demands transcreation, we should transcreate it. But broadly, of course, I mean, you set out to translate or you set out to transcreate. But there are poems, I think, that would border on transcreation in my own translations. Again, as I said, the choice would be dictated by the poem itself. And I must add here that Kunwar Narain himself has been a very avid translator. Translation has played a huge role in his life. From early on, as I said, from his translations of the French symbolist poets to poets like Borges and Cavafy and Roselish and Herbert, and right down to his latest epic poem, which is called Kumarji, which is about a translator. Kumarji was a very, very major translator, ancient Indian Chinese translator who took a lot of Buddhism from India to China. And he was a translator. And Kunwar Narain has been fascinated with his life and with this whole Silk Route and Central Asia. And one of the reasons why he was fascinated was that Kumarji changed the whole ethos of translation. Now, whether you call that transcreation or whether you call it translation is a matter of debate. But these decisions, and in his own translations of all these world poets, Kunwar Narain often transcreates. He often transcreates and he often translates both. So, I mean, it's a matter that's determined by a particular poem, I would say. Yeah.
A couple more questions. There is a question from Akanksha Pandey. How many hours did it approximately take to translate a single poem of average length, since it would have needed a lot of contemplation and finding the words to perfectly convey his original ideas? How much time did you take to translate one poem?
Again, as I said, this has varied a lot from 1 day to 1 year to several months. I mean, the whole thing is a very, very different time scale for different poems. As I said, some poems come very quickly. They sort of hit the right spot at the first go. Some take a long time. So I don't think there's any one answer to this question again. I must also say that in several of my translations I have gone through, and this is again a process that I've seen my own father do, is that he's gone through multiple revisions. Even today, if I were to look at my first book, some of the translations there, I would want to revise them. So it's a very dynamic process. It's never final. There's a poem in his first collection called The Remaining Poem, where he talks about a poem as something that can never be finished. It just has to be left somewhere at some stage, like life. And a translation is also, I think, like that. You have to, at some stage, just leave it there. And when you revisit it after a few years or few months or whatever, you may well want to revise it. So it's never complete in that sense. Yeah.
there is there is a series of questions here.
Yeah.
Narain is in love with nature. Can we say he too becomes nature?
Well, that's a wonderful question. That's a lovely question. Again, he's actually, Kunwar Narain has himself written a lot about this. And, there are two ways of approaching nature. One is I've talked about this in another session recently, is that the environmental way is that I am me, and that is the environment. And the other way is that I am part of nature. That's the ecological perspective. And this has something to do with the philosophy of non-dualism versus dualism. So Narain is definitely embedded in nature in that sense, that he looks at himself as part of nature, not somebody outside of nature looking at nature over there. And therefore, even the humanist tradition that informs his work is not a tradition that looks at human dominance over nature or human dominance over animals or species or other human beings. It's a holistic ecosystem of which he's a part. And he talks of, in a way, interview, he talks very interestingly of how I don't imitate nature, but I am nature. And he goes on to say that my world can be different from our world. There are two kinds of worlds that we create and all of us together create. And my world can be different from yours or can be the same. So yeah, I mean, this whole relationship with nature is a topic for PhD actually. I mean, there's several topics here that could actually transform into PhD topics. And there's again a section in this book on nature poems. And in my previous book, there are 2 sections on nature poems. So there's a huge involvement with nature. Yeah.
Such an uplifting philosophy.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. There is another question. Professor Pandey wants to know, do you plan to publish his poems written in English? Do you plan to publish his poems written in English?
You mean his poems originally?
That he wrote in English, yeah, originally in English,
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, that's a huge decision I have to take. There's a lot of, as I said, he was very careless about publishing, not in his prime, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. His books came 10 years apart, 15 years apart from each other. And he was never in a hurry to publish. So there is a lot of unpublished work, both in Hindi and in English. And it's a very, very difficult call for me to make a judgment on what should be published and what shouldn't be published. But this is a work in progress. And I would definitely want to publish some of his prose writings in English, because he has there's several lectures he has delivered in universities abroad and things like that, which were in English originally. So they are already in a way published material. But his poems are another ballgame, and one has to really exercise one's judgment on it. But I would like to do it, because they're very, very good poems. I've read them, and I would like to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. There is one final question. I want to ask what points we should keep in mind while translating any work, and what ideas should be incorporated while translating. This is a question from Vaibhav Pandey.
I don't know where to begin in this. But keep the poem in mind. That's the first call. I would really, whoever is actually thinking of translating, I would urge them to engage with a piece of work, whether it's prose or poetry or whatever it is, at some length. Read a poem several times. Let it sink into you. Don't just go for a word-to-word replication. I mean, you can do that as well, of course, if it helps your process. But ultimately, as I said, there are a lot of translation theories, and one can talk about this for hours, and we'll have an entire course on this. But let the poem dictate what points you should keep in mind. And as I said, let the central intent of the poem dictate what are the points that you should keep in mind while translating that particular poem. And that could have to do with the content. There's, in my first book, I had cited the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, and he makes a very interesting categorization that you must absolutely adhere to the content of the poem. Next, you must adhere to the verbal rhythm of the poem, and finally to the visual rhythm of the poem. if you have to choose. But again, I said this is just a broad framework. It's not something that you have to apply rigorously to every poem that you translate. And so I mean, there's a lot of translation theories floating around, and you can read and you can see what they say about this. But broadly, as a practitioner of translation, I would say don't go with any preset mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Apurva. I think that this is just the opening of a conversation. And once things get normal, we would love to have you in the department, and then we could just go on with this conversation and the insight that you have provided to us as far as the work of the famous poet Kunwar Narain is concerned. And you have so much to say, and we are all agog with curiosity. Our ears are open. We would just love to, have you in our midst once again, once the pandemic is over. And if there are, I don't think, are there any more questions? Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? There is, I think we could just go on, but it's time to close now because you've been with us for a long time. Unless, is there someone else who would like to say something? Otherwise, I think it's now the close of the session, and I would like to formally invite Dr. Raj Gaurav Verma to propose a formal vote of thanks. And really very, very happy that you came today, Apurva, and you are in our midst. And I'm sure that they have benefited from your insightful remarks and observations and all the hard work you put in and the way you brought him alive in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ranu, for inviting me. And as you said, I would be most happy to come to the department when the pandemic allows it. And it's a very emotional experience for me as well. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And of course, it was a very general talk today. We didn't get into specifics, or we didn't get into particular poems and things, but I'm sure there'll be chances for that. Yeah,
this is the second of our series on translation. This is the first we had last week, and this is the second one. And we hope to continue with it in future. Dr. Raj Gaurav Verma.
Good evening, everybody. Well, it was a pleasure listening to Apur sir. I would just like to begin my thanks with lines from poem An Evening in Golconda, which is written by Kunwar Narain, and it has been translated by Apurva, and he has already referred this poem. So in the poem, there is this line: "With what craft shall we arrange these dissonant lines, so that bravo may echo, so that these desolations may look less desolate." These lines describe life and task of a poet and the translator as well, and a translator like Apurva Narain, who is so closely associated with the poet. And as far as Kunwar Narain is concerned, he occurs to us as a figure with whom we identify as part of our lives, as part of a city, as part of a department, as part of our academics. So we have discussed about his initial, about his birth, about his doing his MA in 1951, and then we have finally come to 2021 when this conversation is going on, and we can clearly feel the impact, the kind of the local as well as the global impact that he had. So not only the influences that he had of Acharya Narendra Dev and Acharya Kripalani and the French symbolists, and his engagement with world literature, as well as Indian literature, as well as the translations with which he engaged. So Apurva sir, he has discussed about the kind of a balance that he had between scientific temper and emotional appeal in his poem. And as Professor Uniyal has referred to the spirit of Buddha and the wisdom of Kabir that could be found. And despite all these, we find that he just avoids any kind of isms and conflicts. And therefore, there is consciously or unconsciously, we find that Kunwar Narain has created a place for Lucknow, as well as for Lucknow University in the global literary tradition. And Apurva sir, he seems to aid through his translation, and through this conversation, we became familiar with the role of a translator and the meticulous efforts that put in replication of the atmosphere, emotions, and thoughts. So with this, I would like to thank Mr. Apurva Narain for sparing his time for all of us and making us familiar with Kunwar Narain as a poet. My sincere thanks goes to Professor Ranu Uniyal, head of the Department of English and Modern European Languages, for beginning with the series of reading translation today, Indian perspective. And today's conversation is like a gem in the crown. And I would like to extend my thanks to Professor Nishi Pandey, Professor Maitri Priyadarshini, Professor Madhu Singh, Dr. V.M. David, and to my colleagues, Dr. Siddharth Singh, Dr. Samina Shafiq, Dr. Seema Sarkar. My sincere thanks goes to the students who have recited the poem today, Akansha Pandey, Pranjal Krishna, and Pragya Tiwari, and all the students who have been the part of this conversation. With best wishes and prayers for good health. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So nice.
Thank you very much. So take your leave.